In 1977, a small commuter airline called Comair began operating out of Cincinnati's airport with a fleet of 2 turboprop aircraft, shuttling passengers on short hops to Akron. The entire operation was almost absurdly modest. A handful of planes, a handful of routes, a dozen employees working out of a single counter. The airline's 4 founders had no ambitions to build a global carrier. They simply wanted to connect Cincinnati to the rest of Ohio. Nobody could have predicted what would happen next. Within 22 years, Comair would become the largest regional airline in the United States, operating hundreds of daily flights across dozens of cities. Its home airport, Cincinnati Northern Kentucky International, would process tens of millions of passengers annually, peaking at 22.4 million in 2000. CVG would become Delta Airlines' second largest hub on the planet and the 4th largest single airline hub in the entire world, behind only Atlanta, Chicago O'Hare, and Dallas-Fort Worth. For decades, the airline industry accepted a simple truth about hub-and-spoke networks. Big hubs require big cities. Population drives demand. Demand justifies infrastructure. Cincinnati, a metropolitan area of barely 2 million people, seemed to violate every principle of airline economics. But here's what nobody anticipated. The same forces that elevated Cincinnati to extraordinary prominence would destroy it with almost surgical precision. Between 2005 and 2012, CVG lost nearly 75% of its passengers. Daily departures collapsed, a $50 million concourse was demolished, jobs vanished. The catalyst wasn't a natural disaster, it wasn't a recession, it was a single corporate decision: the 2008 merger between Delta Airlines and Northwest Airlines. So, how did a mid-sized Midwestern city build one of the largest airline hubs in human history? And how did that hub disappear almost overnight? The answer reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how American aviation actually works. To understand why Cincinnati became a mega hub, you need to understand what airlines were doing after the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. Before deregulation, the federal government told airlines where to fly. After deregulation, carriers were free to build their own networks, and the model they chose was hub and spoke. The logic is straightforward. Instead of flying passengers directly between every possible city pair, you funnel everyone through a central connecting point. A hub with 50 destinations doesn't need hundreds of individual routes. It needs 50 spokes and one airport in the middle. Delta Airlines dominated the Southeast through its fortress hub in Atlanta, but Atlanta left a gap: the lucrative Midwest market, filled with corporate headquarters and business travelers, remained underserved. United and American already controlled Chicago. Continental had locked down Cleveland. Northwestern had Detroit and Minnesota. Delta needed a Midwestern foothold. Cincinnati was geographically perfect, positioned within a 2-hour flight of 60% of the continental United States population. CVG sat at the intersection of Eastern and Midwestern traffic flows. The metropolitan area hosted Fortune 500 headquarters, including Procter & Gamble, Kroger, and Fifth Third Bancorp, generating reliable premium travel demand. In the mid-1980s, Delta officially designated CVG as a hub. The airline began pouring capital into the airport: 22 gates. Then, a massive expansion. In the early 1990s, Delta invested over $500 million to construct Terminal 3, a sprawling complex spanning concourses A, B, and C, purpose-built for hub operations. A dedicated people mover system connecting Terminal 3 to its concourses was inaugurated in June 1994, mirroring the automated systems at Atlanta Hartsfield. But infrastructure alone doesn't build a mega hub. What transformed Cincinnati from a regional facility into a global powerhouse was a revolutionary piece of technology that arrived in 1993. Comair and SkyWest Airlines became the North American launch customer for the Bombardier Canadair regional jet, CRJ-100. This was not an incremental upgrade, it was a paradigm shift. Before the CRJ, regional aviation meant slow, noisy turboprops flying short distances. The CRJ offered jet speed, jet comfort, and a 50-seat configuration that could profitably connect tiny markets directly to a hub. Cities that were too small to justify a mainline Boeing 737 could suddenly sustain multiple daily frequencies on a regional jet. And Comair exploited this advantage ruthlessly from Cincinnati. Routes as short as 64 miles to Dayton became economically viable, but so did connections stretching to Maine, Mexico, the Bahamas, and beyond. Comair's CRJ fleet turned CVG into a vacuum, pulling passengers from hundreds of small communities across the eastern half of the continent and funneling them through Cincinnati's concourses toward Delta's mainline network. By 1999, Delta acquired Comair outright for over $1.8 billion, assuming $100 million of its debt in the process. CVG's daily departures surged past 600 in the early 2000s, a staggering number for a city of Cincinnati's size. The route map at CVG's peak was extraordinary. Domestically, Delta and Comair served nearly 150 destinations. Internationally, passengers could board non-stop Delta flights to Amsterdam, Frankfurt, London Gatwick, Paris, Rome, and Zurich. The Paris flight became locally famous as the P&G Express, a nod to the Procter & Gamble executives who filled its business class cabin at prices ordinary travelers could never afford. This brings us to a critical detail that would define CVG's ultimate tragedy. The hub was magnificent in scope, but deeply flawed in structure, and the flaw was price. Delta controlled over 90% of all flights at CVG during the hub's peak years. In market concentration terms, this was a near monopoly, and Delta exploited that monopoly to extract maximum revenue from captive passengers. For years, Cincinnati consistently ranked as the most expensive major airport in the United States. Fares from CVG regularly exceeded national averages. Business travelers working for Procter & Gamble, Kroger, and other local corporations had no realistic alternative. Delta owned the gates and set the prices. When competitors attempted to challenge this dominance, Delta responded with overwhelming force. The pattern was identical each time. A low-cost carrier would announce a competing route. Delta would immediately slash its own fares on that route and flood it with additional capacity. The competitor would bleed cash on the competing routes. The competitor would then withdraw. Delta would then raise its fares back to monopolistic levels the following week. The result was a paradox that few outsiders understood. Cincinnati had one of the most connected airports in the United States, but the people who actually lived in Cincinnati couldn't afford to use it. Residents routinely drove hours to Dayton, Louisville, or Indianapolis to access affordable flights from low-cost carriers. The hub served connecting passengers magnificently. It served local passengers terribly. This structural vulnerability meant CVG's prosperity was entirely dependent on Delta's continued strategic commitment. The millions of annual passengers weren't Cincinnati's passengers. They were Delta's passengers passing through Cincinnati on their way somewhere else. The moment Delta decided those passengers should connect somewhere else, Cincinnati had almost nothing to fall back on. That moment arrived in two devastating waves. The first cracks appeared in 2001 when Comair's 1,350 pilots launched a strike on March 26th, demanding pay that reflected the sophisticated jet aircraft they were actually flying, rather than the turboprop-era wages they were receiving. Delta's management miscalculated catastrophically. The strike lasted 89 agonizing days. Comair's entire fleet was grounded. Delta's connections to its cities were severed. The parent company absorbed millions in losses. Over 2,400 non-pilot Comair workers lost their jobs during the stoppage. The strike poisoned labor relations permanently and planted the first seeds of Delta's decision to eventually seek cheaper regional alternatives. Then came the 2004 Christmas disaster. A localized blizzard at CVG depleted Comair's de-icing fluid reserves, triggering a catastrophic IT system failure. 30,000 passengers were stranded during the busiest travel period of the year. By September 2005, facing insolvency, Delta Airlines filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The airline needed to shed costs immediately, and CVG, with its expensive infrastructure, expensive regional subsidiary, and expensive labor agreements, presented an obvious target. Delta cut 26% of CVG's flights before the end of 2005. International routes began vanishing. The expansion plans, including new runways, were halted immediately. But the bankruptcy cuts were merely a prelude. The true destruction was still 3 years away. On April 14, 2008, Delta Airlines announced a $3.1 billion merger with Northwest Airlines. The combined entity would become the world's largest carrier. Delta CEO Richard Anderson appeared before congressional committees and delivered explicit assurances. The merger, he testified, was about addition, not subtraction. No hubs would be closed. These claims proved entirely false. Northwest Airlines brought 3 major hubs into the merger: Detroit, Minneapolis-St. Paul, and Memphis. The moment network planners examined the combined map, 2 collisions became immediately obvious. Detroit sat merely 200 miles north of Cincinnati. The 2 hubs served virtually identical catchment areas, but Detroit was vastly superior. Northwest had built DTW into a massive international gateway with 6 jet runways, an ultra-modern terminal complex, and highly lucrative Asian routes that Delta desperately wanted to absorb. Cincinnati couldn't compete. Similarly, Memphis sat fewer than 400 miles from Delta's Atlanta superhub, making it geographically redundant for southern connecting traffic. The arithmetic was merciless. Delta didn't need 6 hubs, it needed 4. Cincinnati and Memphis were expendable. Delta began removing capacity from Cincinnati and Memphis. Concourse C, the $50 million facility, opened in 1994 specifically for Comair's regional jet operations, was shuttered in 2008 and ultimately demolished in 2016. Concourse A was closed in 2010, triggering layoffs. Comair itself ceased operations in September 2012. The airline that had pioneered the regional jet revolution, that had grown from 3 turboprops into a multi-billion operation, ceased all operations. More than 3 decades of service ended with a quiet announcement and thousands of terminated employees. Daily departures at CVG had collapsed from more than 670 in March 2005 to roughly 200 in March 2011. Passenger volumes cratered. International non-stop destinations fell. Connecting passengers, the lifeblood of any hub operation, plummeted. The hub was functionally dead. The economic devastation radiated outward. A University of Cincinnati study had estimated that CVG generated $4.5 billion annually for the regional economy during its peak years. The post-merger collapse erased roughly $1 billion of that annually and displaced an estimated 33,000 jobs, directly or indirectly tied to airport operations. Perhaps most damaging was the corporate flight. When businesses evaluated the Cincinnati region, reduced air connectivity became measurable liability. The hub's death wasn't just an aviation story, it was reshaping the economic identity of an entire metropolitan area. In 2017, Delta officially downgraded CVG from hub to focus city status. Later, even that diminished designation was quietly removed. Something nearly identical happened in Memphis. The airport, which had over 2,000 weekly departures in the early 2000s, had fewer than 1,000 by late 2012. The hubs never returned. But here's where this entire story takes a big unexpected turn. The tragedy of Cincinnati isn't simply about one airline abandoning one airport. It's about what a single merger can reveal about the fundamental fragility of American aviation infrastructure. You see, the Cincinnati hub didn't fail because Cincinnati was a bad location. It didn't fail because demand evaporated. Local origin and destination passenger numbers remained remarkably stable throughout the entire collapse. People in Cincinnati still wanted to fly. The routes were still viable. What failed was a model. The hub-and-spoke system grants airlines extraordinary power over the cities they choose as hubs. Delta built CVG into a colossus, not because Cincinnati needed the daily departures it offered, but because Delta's network needed a Midwestern funnel. The moment Delta acquired a better funnel 200 miles north, Cincinnati's entire aviation economy became expendable. The city had invested hundreds of millions in infrastructure. Local governments had provided tax incentives and development support. Workers had built careers around airport operations. Businesses had located headquarters based on connectivity promises, and all of it could be unwound by a single boardroom decision in Atlanta. This is the structural vulnerability that Cincinnati exposed. When over 90% of an airport's traffic consists of connecting passengers controlled by a single carrier, the city doesn't really have an airport. It has a landlord, and landlords can leave. The same pattern repeated at Memphis, where Delta cut departures post-merger. It echoed at St. Louis, which TWA had built a major hub before American Airlines acquired TWA in 2001 and systematically dismantled the operation. Cleveland suffered similarly after the United Continental merger. Every secondary hub that has been destroyed during the consolidation era shares the same fatal characteristic: overwhelming dependence on a single carrier's connecting traffic, with insufficient local demand to sustain operations independently. CVG's former CEO, Candice McGraw, inherited what seemed like an impossible situation. Her assessment was blunt: "We had all our eggs in one basket. Where we relied on one airline, you see what happens," she said during a press conference announcing British Airways flights from CVG to London Heathrow. McGraw's strategy was radical in its simplicity: diversify everything. The airport reclaimed gates that Delta had abandoned. Terminal leases were restructured to lower barriers for new entrants. Frontier Airlines, Allegiant Air, and Southwest Airlines were actively courted with competitive terms. The airport that once charged the highest fares in America began offering some of the most competitive prices in the Midwest. By 2024, CVG served 9.2 million passengers, a 15-year high. Approximately 70% of passengers now fly non-stop to their final destination, a complete inversion of the hub era. Delta remains the largest single carrier at roughly 40% market share in terms of weekly departing ASKs in May, but it no longer controls the airport's density. The airline even extended its maintenance hangar lease at CVG through 2036. But the most transformative pivot was cargo. Amazon invested $1.5 billion to build its prime air hub at CVG, leasing 900 acres under a 50-year agreement to house over 100 cargo aircraft. DHL broke ground on a $292 million maintenance facility, expanding its existing North American global hub. By 2024, CVG's total annual economic impact had reached $10.5 billion, more than double its passenger hub peak. McGraw described the philosophy simply: in leadership, you have to be able to stand the sight of your own blood. In 1977, David Mueller started Comair with a handful of small planes and a simple idea about connecting Cincinnati to the rest of Ohio. He couldn't have imagined that his airline would pioneer an entire category of aviation and ultimately be destroyed by the same corporate parent that made its expansion possible. For the airport, the route from 3 turboprops to 670 daily departures was extraordinary. The collapse from 670 departures to fewer than 100 was devastating. And the recovery, built on a different business model, was something else entirely. Where Concourse C once stood, the one demolished in 2016 after sitting dark and empty for 8 years, Amazon cargo jets now taxi past on their way to the prime air hub. The moving walkways that once played announcements to empty hallways have been replaced by conveyor belts, sorting packages for next-day delivery. CVG today generates more economic value than it ever did as Delta's second-largest hub. But the 33,000 jobs that vanished between 2008 and 2013 didn't come back. The Comair pilots and flight attendants who built their careers around a regional airline that no longer exists didn't get rehired by Amazon. The corporate headquarters that left Cincinnati, citing reduced air service, didn't return. Cincinnati's tragedy isn't that its hub failed. Hubs fail. Networks get reorganized. Airlines merge and consolidate. That's the industry. Cincinnati's tragedy is that the city was asked to bet its economic future on infrastructure designed to serve an airline's strategy rather than a region's needs. And when the strategy changed, the city absorbed the entire cost of a decision it never had the power to make. The question isn't whether another mid-sized American city will suffer Cincinnati's fate, it's whether the cities that still depend on a single carrier's hub are really paying attention. Hey, before you go, the YouTube algorithm thinks you're going to like this video next, so why not check it out?